Thank you to the patrons for supporting the channel. Welcome to your first session. I understand you've been having trouble sleeping. Well, I'm sure I can help you with that. First, though, I need to ask you some preliminary questions. Do these photos mean anything to you? When you were a kid, did you ever think that your house may be haunted? A creak, a noise, a flash of a shadow, and now your mind is racing, coming up the stairs or the trek from the light switch in the kitchen to the safety of your bedroom. Your heart running like a train, you run like it's life and death. But by the time you're lying in bed, that fear, that panic, it almost seems foolish. And yet still, you can't shake the feeling of those eyes on the back of your neck. The Children Under the House is a horror web series created by Vintage 8, and it is particularly fascinating to me, because while it does include some of the trappings of the usual genre, like a VHS aesthetic and supernatural elements, it feels like it comes from an entirely different place, to the degree that I'm not sure if I should call it a web series. Maybe a better description would be an indie horror film, because after it was released in parts, it was cut together into a cohesive feature-length piece. Either way, it's a very unique project, because while it definitely fits the analog horror genre, it feels strangely disconnected. Much of the genre's other series are very inter-inspired, if you get what I'm saying. There's a sort of feedback loop of projects getting inspired by each other that can sometimes make the style feel very insulated. But The Children Under the House clearly comes from the outside, and provides something really fresh, which is a quality I think spans most of Vintage 8's work. Oh, and a huge shout out to Vintage 8 for actually mailing me some of the drawings that were actually used in the making of this series. It's really cool, and you'll be seeing them throughout this video. Anyway, hopefully that opening description has got you excited, because it's time to dive right into The Children Under the House. Alright, well, for our first course of action, I'd like to try a quick breathing exercise. Close your eyes and breathe deeply. To start this breakdown of the series, let's just explain the premise. As introduced in the beginning, the following are a set of tapes discovered in a repossessed storage unit, belonging to a child therapist, Julia Liu. She has recorded these tapes to keep track of a patient she's working on, and sending them to another therapist friend, John, who is helping her with the case. Eventually, she wants to work with John to turn this case, which she finds fascinating, into a book. So these are the notes and communications of a therapist working with a child and her family. What are the circumstances of this case? A young girl, Jess, was a normal, healthy kid. However, when her father, Adam, moved the family, Jess, her mother Carol, and older brother Dean, from Houston to Kate's Crossing for work, Jess started having nightmares and began talking about children who live under the house. The house itself used to be owned by a beloved local family, the Clarks, who moved away not too long ago. They used to own a burger joint called the Burger Shack. In any case, Jess's father eventually took her into the basement to show her that there's no one there, where Jess had a meltdown and since then has not spoken, only communicating through drawings and writing. This is the case Julia Liu was presented with, and these drawings are the main lens we see the story through. I should also mention that originally, the series was done with this really heavy VHS overlay. Personally, I like the atmosphere that it brought, but it was quite abrasive, and for people who are sensitive to flashing lights, was pretty unapproachable. Even I had to take a couple breaks while watching. So Vintage 8 eventually released a version with high-res images and no VHS filter, and while it is more accessible, I found it a bit less atmospheric. So I've made a compromise. I've added my own, hopefully a little subtler, analog filter. Hopefully this will keep the analog aspect while still being pleasant to watch. If you'd like to see either original versions, go check out Vintage 8's channel. And you should check out the channel anyways. The Children Under the House is fantastic, and there's a lot of other unique pieces of analog horror and other series on there. Anyway, let's take a look at Jess and Julia's first session.
Hi Jess, my name is Miss Julia. How are you today?
Julia's first session with Jess starts as normal as it can. Julia asks some simple questions: what's your favorite food, what's your favorite color? When asked to draw herself, Jess draws herself frowning, and when asked why, she gives no response. When asked where she got the teddy bear in the drawing, Jess says it belongs to a friend. Julia inquires about this friend, and Jess looks to the corner of the room and then shakes her head. Julia takes this to mean she believes that the friend is in the room with them, that this friend is imaginary. Jess provides this unsettling visage as a depiction of this friend.
Another note. That clearly looks like a face. It appears that she has an imaginary friend.
But when Julia asks to further engage about the friend, Jess stops engaging altogether. In the end, though, Julia believes this was a good start.
So how are you doing today?
Julia starts to get a little deeper with the questions, asking Jess what she would do if she had 3 wishes. Jess's 3 are for her family to be happy, to move back to Houston, and for the children under the house to be free. They're stuck. Jess then finally introduces Julia to her imaginary friend, Maya, who Jess draws as a bloody, dead girl whose torso has been split in half. She reveals there are 10, maybe more children who live under the house. As Julia probes further, a picture frame falls off the wall, startling them both.
Would you like them to go away?
Julia theorizes that the children under the house, her imaginary friends, represent Jess's friends back in Houston. Julia ends on a simple note. She thinks her office has rats, as something's eating all the candy.
Would you like to play another game?
Julia inquires further about Maya, to which Jess tells her Maya doesn't get to grow up. She's dead. This continues as we see crude drawings of Maya inside the trunk of a car and a crash that seems to have killed everyone inside, including Maya. Jess goes on to explain that Maya doesn't remember much, but she knows that bad people put her there. Now she lives under the house with her friends. Julia shifts the question to these other friends, and Jess explains that only she can see them. Some of them are nice, others are scary and want to hurt her. They want her to live under the house, but Maya protects her. Julia asks Jess to bring drawings of her other friends in the next session. Jess says the children under the house are sorry about eating all the candy, which Julia finds odd because she never mentioned anything about the missing candy. In any case, she assigns Jess and her father some homework. Adam seems very wrapped up in his work, and it's possible his unattentiveness is contributing to Jess's behavior, so Julia tells them to have a bit of a back and forth at least once a day, and bring the notes back in the next session. On her way out, Julia seems perturbed by Carol's behavior, Jess's mother. She seemed very worried and asked if the Clarks had any children, as she keeps finding old toys around the house. The Clarks did not. Adam and Jess start the homework as expected, but Adam quickly becomes disturbed by Jess's depictions of these ghosts. He ends the sessions quickly and eventually stops doing the homework altogether. Julia believes Jess was partially doing this on purpose, pushing Adam just to see if he'd stay. Unfortunately, Adam did not. The last bit of homework is done by Carol, who muses to Jess about moving back to Houston. Despite being one of her wishes initially, Jess is now upset by this. The children under the house will never let them leave. They're a family now. Jess also seems to push a bit on her mother, telling her that she knows she's seen the children too. Julia decides to recommend a marriage counselor to Adam and Carol. Carol shows up to Julia's office suddenly, seemingly very distressed. She tells Julia that she let herself believe it all, that there really were ghosts of children under the house. She had the whole yard dug up, and under the house. Even got police dogs involved, but there was nothing. Julia is bothered by this. While glad that Carol eventually let the idea go, she worries that Carol's immediate willingness to believe it and erratic behavior is bad for Jess, and even considers getting child services involved. Either way, Adam calls about a marriage counselor, which Julia thinks is a good sign.
Considering what I have reviewed in the homework and the conversation with Mrs. Daniels, I was surprised to find Jess in such a chipper mood.
Adam has decided to commit more time to the family and is even going to take the family on a vacation. Jess's sunny disposition is soon overshadowed when Jess hands Julia the folder of drawings detailing her other friends from under the house.
John, I thought I was prepared to see what she wanted to show me. I was wrong.
We see a collage of children and Jess's explanations. Maya was stolen away, lured with the stuffed bear we saw in the first session, and we see new children. Shelley, a tangled mess of stretched limbs and nervous system. They gave her medicine, but it was too much, and she woke up under the house. Wendy, a warped girl with a long, twisted neck, who remembers being dead before she died. Death was supposed to be freedom. Instead, it was another prison. Zach, a flaming silhouette shoved in the fireplace after his death. Brad, forgotten and left behind where he met his fate. His body is still where they left it. Mark, an erratic form of Loops, meeting his end when he tried to run. And Kate, the one Jess is most afraid of. A mass of twisting arms and hands. A hand for every hand that hurt her. But most of the children under the house can't remember anything. They're lost souls. Jess explains that the reason she can see them is because she traded her voice for eyes. She may get her voice back, if the children ever get to leave. Jess leaves one last note. Maya says Julia talks to a friend too. she knows about John. Utterly disturbed by the contents of this folder, and at a complete loss for how Jess even knows about John, she decides to investigate further. Maybe Jess is getting these details from somewhere.
They're all real, John.
Julia's worst fears are realized. It's all true. Every name Jess pointed out was a real missing persons case in the town of Kate's Crossing, and the trail ends with Maya. The kidnappers of these children getting into a fatal car accident, with Maya in the trunk tragically ending her life as well. This section ends when Julia gets a call and is informed that Adam has just been murdered. Adam was killed in what was reported as a carjacking gone wrong. After the tragedy, Carol is moving the family back to Houston, but wants Jess to have one more session. Julia is concerned about the move. She can't get Jess's statement about the children never letting them leave out of her mind. She decides to show Carol the articles, hoping to convince her to stay, and while Carol seems to believe Julia, she says the threat of the children under the house is all the more reason to leave. Meanwhile, during the session, Jess reveals some important information. Firstly, that Shelley apparently followed her father around a lot and saw his murder, and she said the man in the mask sounded familiar. Julia asks if her friends can give any more information about what happened to them. Jess looks all around the room, and Julia gets the creeping feeling that the entire office is full of ghosts surrounding them. Jess says they remember food, people talking, a dark place, money, a woman who brought them food, a man who brought toys. Julia vows to try her best to find where the kids are and attempt to free them. As Jess and Julia part ways, Jess tells her something disturbing. She's not going to Houston. The ghosts won't let her. They're going to take her to live under the house. And Jess is right. Before they can even leave the city limits, Jess has a seizure and is left almost unresponsive, so the family stays, for now. Every day, Julia receives drawings, presumably made by Jess, to her office. Judging by them, Jess is almost already dead. Jess has resigned herself to the same fate as her spectral friends. Meanwhile, Julia is deep into further investigating. She called the Clarks to see if they remember anything strange, but Mrs. Clark doesn't remember anything odd. Julia begins looking into the supernatural side of things, trying to put the pieces together. She connects the dots. The children weren't being murdered, at least that wasn't the goal. They were being trafficked and drugged, which is why they can't seem to remember anything. They're stuck in the state right before they passed, a drug-induced trance that is preventing them from thinking clearly. But their kidnappers are dead, so why haven't the children been able to move on? There's something keeping them there. Pieces are still missing, but they start coming together when Julia begins taking each of Jess's drawings of the children and connecting them. There's a bigger picture here, and reveals the Burger Shack and the Clarks. Shocked by the revelation that the Clarks were somehow involved, and now afraid of the consequences now that she's already called the Clarks and told them everything she knows, her thoughts are interrupted by a phone call, telling her that Jess is awake, and Julia rushes to the house to see her.
Why was she able to wake up now? What changed? Did I do something? Hell, maybe the ghost let Jess go. Maybe she escaped. Why does this feel too easy?
From here, we hear Julia's notes after having visited Jess. As you may have been suspicious of, Jess hadn't really woken up. It was a setup. When she opened the door, she found the Clarks, a gun in her face, and Jess and her family being held hostage. We see drawings made by Jess after the fact, which are surprisingly accurate despite her almost comatose state. While held at gunpoint, Julia uses her knowledge of psychology to try and get the Clarks to talk, explain themselves, and stall for time. We learn that when the Clarks found themselves in hard times, they allowed the Burger Shack to be used as a front for traffickers. They never hurt anyone, and no one was supposed to die, but all of that changes very little when they knowingly aided in the death and trafficking of possibly dozens of children. They also killed Adam in hopes of getting the family to leave. In the end, though, the Clarks intend to kill everyone there. In one last scramble to save their lives, Julia eggs the Clarks on, asking if they even remember the children's names, hoping that if the children under the house hear their names said by the Clarks, they'll be able to remember and be able to save them somehow. And it works. The spirits of the children appear and literally rip the Clarks limb from limb and drag every last piece off to somewhere unknown, never to be seen again. Julia concludes with some information. The rest of the town will likely never know what really happened to the Clarks, and the town will always see them as upstanding citizens who disappeared one day. But Jess says they're literally in hell. So that's nice. Jess woke up from her coma not long after, and while she still doesn't speak, Carol says the house feels lighter, like a great weight has been lifted. The family decides to move back to Houston, but not before this final session.
So how are you today? Are you looking forward to moving back to Houston? Your mom said you still aren't speaking. Have you given it a try? No. Jess just shrugged and smiled. Looks like I got my wish. I got a happy Jess after all. Have you seen Maya or the others?
They're free now.
No, John. Her little voice was the sweetest sound I've ever heard.
10 years pass, and Julia gives us a bit of a catch-up on how the family has been. Carol never remarried, Dean is studying finance, and Jess is about to graduate high school and move away for college. She doesn't remember the children under the house. Hey! You must have drifted asleep. In any case, for our next exercise, I want to show you a photo, and then you tell me how it makes you feel. One of the things I find most fascinating about The Children Under the House is how I feel it ties into the larger horror landscape, especially recently. But before we move into a more cross-media analysis, I want to take a bit to appreciate the work itself, starting with its execution. Visually, the series has a pretty unique and strong style that it commits to fully. Everything is portrayed through the drawings created by Jess, filtering the world through this imperfect lens that more suggests than it does outright tell you anything. It leaves so many gaps for your mind to fill in. I find this especially true in the character designs of the ghost children. Long, twisting limbs and amorphous bodies. Along with Jess's descriptions, there's the implication of what happened to each of them, and the implications of what their aspirations look like. Shelley is the creepiest to me. It almost feels like just a nervous system. But the key point here being that they don't actually show you. They give you enough information to expand on those implications in your mind. And also, there's some really unsettling implications that come along with Jess making these drawings in the first place. She can't quite put it on the page perfectly, but you know that she's being shown these horrific sights in detail, from the deaths of these spirits to the murder of her own father. It's deeply unsettling and sad to think about a child having to be shown these things, especially from the perspective that they happened. On top of that, the VHS filter over the original version added this haze over the whole thing, compression, flickering colors that made it even more ambiguous, almost like you were seeing the ghostly figures yourself, barely able to focus on the blurry silhouettes of something terrifying masked through the veil between our world and theirs. And I just think it's an incredible way to tell a story with the limitations that independent filmmakers have. Almost no budget, but using those limitations as a strength and creating a really stylistically unique piece, even in the realm of other analog horror projects. The sound design definitely contributes to this atmosphere as well. Everly Catalanotto's clinical delivery that every now and then breaks when her character is genuinely afraid made the whole thing sound very authentic, and to me, gives an almost film noir vibe. I really think her voice acting as Julia Liu should get a lot of credit because hers is the sole voice you hear throughout the entire series, with the exception of Jess at the very end. And let me say, that final line by Jess is adorable. But Julia's voice carries a lot of the weight. And the music, while none of the tracks particularly stand out, except maybe the ominous thumping during the big reveal section, it definitely would feel empty without the music. The low, ominous tones make the whole thing feel uneasy and tense all the way through, even when nothing scary is happening. It just reminds you of the darker things that are lurking around, like the ghosts hanging in Julia Liu's office. Also, considering the project is a horror piece in the analog horror genre, it manages to be very subtle when it comes to the scares. There's only a few moments I'd classify as jump scares, and even then they're very subtle, and I'd argue well earned. The building of the tension in the conversation and a frame shattering. Even something as simple as Jess's switch to big red letters when writing to Adam can feel jarring. Genuine moments where you breathe in sharply and a little bit of real fear enters your mind. In a similar vein, the pacing of the whole story is really well done. You always feel like there's new information being revealed, and it doesn't ever drag, and yet it lets moments breathe when they need to. Aside from those more aesthetic elements though, the story it's telling is actually really intriguing. I feel like despite being only really told the story directly through Julia Liu and Jess's drawings, we get a lot of depth throughout all these characters. And I think that's one of the things that really makes the story work, the characters. Now, here's the thing. None of the characters are particularly unique. They can fit pretty cleanly into archetypes that you've probably seen before. But the writing does a really good job of connecting you to the experiences of these characters, especially Jess, who aside from just seeing ghosts, is going through an incredibly unstable situation in her home life, leaving her friends and old home behind, parents whose marriage is failing, an overstressed mother and an inattentive father. I guess that's what's at the core of the story, empathy. And not just for Jess and her family, for the children under the house too. Much of the details are left ambiguous, ambiguous, but there is never a question about what these kids are feeling. Lost, confused, in pain. It's really a shortcut to the heartstrings hearing about the pain these spirits had to endure. And there's a special kind of unease there. Sure, the ghosts that are hurting Jess are scary, but there's a deep sadness knowing why and how they are where they are. They're not villains. They're victims. And I like that we get to focus more on that element instead of focusing really hard on the villains. It's a side of horror that I think often gets overlooked, especially in the analog horror format. It's sometimes easier to look at the cool, spooky villain than actually try to develop the victims beyond, yeah, they died. And I think this series does a good job of refocusing that narrative. All of that being said, I do think it has a couple low points. While for the most part, the voice acting really carries it, there are some moments, for instance when Adam's murder is revealed, that you can definitely tell this series is an indie project. Just a few moments here and there that take me out of it. Some of that being because Julia's dialogue doesn't necessarily drop the clinical and straightforward delivery when it feels like it should have. The ending also felt a little too exposition-y. I think that sequence when they're in the house at gunpoint is really stretching the limitations of the format. In a more traditional film setup, it could have worked, but it feels slightly ridiculous to see this whole situation play out through the drawings of these two goofy MFers. And I also felt the one issue I had with the pacing was that the twist felt a little too easy to figure out a little too early. The Burger Shack is right there, and I just felt like, oh, I got it, a little sooner than I think Vintage 8 was intending. But otherwise, I think almost all the aspects of this project were really strong. I guess the last element I want to discuss here when it comes to analyzing the series itself, outside of the cross-media lens, is looking at its themes and the execution of these themes. I think the thing this series really does best is really specific connections between the supernatural elements of the series and the personal elements that feel much more real. And it does this mostly through the view of Jess. Jess's experiences of loss of control and instability in her home life are directly connected to the supernatural elements plaguing her. I want to start with one that I can relate to. When I was really young, probably around Jess's age, my family packed up where we lived my entire life and moved to Maine. I wouldn't call this traumatic, and I do still have a soft spot for New England from my time there, but there was definitely an element during the move of a feeling of loss of control. It wasn't my decision to make, and as we sold some things and packed up others, it could feel like I was being trapped without the ability to make decisions for myself. Jess is in a similar situation. She has no control over her life, as her entire life as she knew it is uprooted and she has no way to stop it. She's trapped. In that way, it mirrors the children being stuck in the house too, unable to move on despite their wishes. This is further reinforced when her family does try to move back to Houston and the spirits stop them, trying to drag Jess into their world as well. In the same way, Jess losing her voice emphasizes and parallels her inability to make her own voice heard in her family, whether that be in the decision to move away from Houston or the unattentive nature of her family, especially her father, a literal manifestation of how this feeling of being unheard affects her. And that permeates the entire story from Jess to the children, whose lives were taken by adults who exerted control over them, whether that be directly or the enablers who turned a blind eye to their mistreatment. And in a weirdly beautiful way, despite Jess's inability to speak, she becomes the voice of these victims, helping them as she carries both their literal burdens through visions of what happened to them, but also through the feelings that she has, that she can relate to their issues as well. The other thing I find really interesting isn't just the feeling of being trapped, but the feeling of instability. Her life uprooted and the family troubles in her household, especially from the point of view of a child, is strange and hard to understand. And in this way, it mirrors the experiences of the ghost children. What happened to them before, uprooted and put into a horrifying situation that they cannot fully understand, but also their experiences as ghosts, perpetually stuck in a state where they cannot remember or really understand what is happening to them. Now, horror does this all the time, connecting the supernatural elements to real fears and experiences of people, but I think this series does it in a particularly effective way. And in the same way, the fear of your house being haunted, of something terrible having happened, or seeing things in the dark, it's a sort of universal experience, and when you're a kid, it feels that much more believable. It feels like anything could happen when you're at that age. But this haunted house aspect, especially from the point of view of a child, is where we can really start making connections to other pieces of media. So without further ado, let's get into a bit of cross-media analysis. You know, I'm not superstitious, but sometimes I almost get the feeling that this office is haunted. The haunted house. a staple of horror practically synonymous with the genre. From neighborhood attractions to a terrifying short story to a local legend, haunted house works of old were grand, cold, gothic tales, Victorian mansions, gothic architecture, 19th century fashion and sensibilities, based on the legends and tales of spirits wandering the halls of estates, the melancholy tales of romance ending in tragedy, or castles with a dark past. 1944's The Uninvited is largely considered to be the first real haunted house film, complete with the Gothic style. And while this 19th century flair finds its way into many modern haunted house stories, as the world modernized, so too did the haunted house concept.
They're here.
1982's Poltergeist is a true modern haunted house story, set in a cozy suburb instead of a mansion, inseparably connected to the modern elements of the household, like the television set, in a way that I feel must have inspired many of the analog horror themes of something sinister hiding in the static of a TV broadcast. Most importantly, though, Poltergeist held an element we see in Children Under the House, and countless other horror media in the modern era, the family drama aspect. As much as Poltergeist is about the haunting, it is about the picturesque family to which this haunting is occurring, and that connection to the children under the house even goes as far as the aspect of the spirits attaching themselves to the little girl in the family. A haunted house story for the modern Americana. Side note, one way I think The Children Under the House modernizes its story, at least in the sense that it's more modern than the 19th century form, is the origin of the ghosts. The story takes place sometime between the 70s and 90s, at the height of a massive panic in the US around kidnapping, the stranger danger wave. And I think that origin tying into the time period in this way, instead of say an ancient burial ground or something like that, is a really successful way of tying in the time period it's set in. Coming back to this family drama aspect though, this element isn't exclusive to Poltergeist, nor was it even the first, and it definitely wouldn't be the last. Almost a decade before Poltergeist, 1973's The Exorcist doesn't relate to a haunted house per se, or even ghosts as much as a possession, but it does focus on the supernatural affliction of a young girl, and importantly, focuses on her family's dynamic and their struggles. And jumping into a more recent example, Netflix's adaptation of the 1959 gothic horror novel The Haunting of Hill House does keep to its gothic roots, but also spends a lot of time focusing on the family dynamics, and uses the elements of the supernatural to accentuate the issues and bonds the characters work through and form throughout the story. While the likes of Poltergeist brought the haunted house story into the modern age in the 1980s, I think The Children Under the House successfully brings the haunted house concept into the digital age, which is ironic because it does this by creating an analog horror series. But by taking all these classic horror elements and bringing them into this new genre, it in turn modernizes one of the most iconic horror concepts for an entirely new generation of horror audience. And there's another piece of recent horror media that I think does this in a similar way.
In this house.
Skinamarink was released late last year and arrived to mixed reception. It's definitely not a typical film. I'd argue much more experimental and off the wall than even Children Under the House. It's a difficult movie to talk about because of how unconventional it is, so let me just read the blurb. Two children wake up in the middle of the night to find their father is missing, and all the windows and doors in their home have vanished. While the story definitely takes a more House of Leaves approach than Haunting of Hill House, there are lots of similarities you can draw between Skinamarink and The Children Under the House, the most obvious of which starting would be the clear influence from Poltergeist. For Skinamarink that would be more visually, and their taking of the haunted house concept and pushing it even more modern. Skinamarink is a feature-length film that was released in theaters, but it could very easily be fitted into the analog horror genre, from the use of the TV throughout to the heavy film grain over the entire movie. And before Skinamarink, director Kyle Edward Ball was creating horror shorts on YouTube, including lo-fi soundscapes that feel very much internet-specific in context. And yet he took those elements of internet horror and placed them into a theater-released film. Similarly, although The Children Under the House started as a web series, it was eventually cut together as a feature-length film, and in a similar way combines more traditional horror film elements with a very modern and internet-specific element. Aside, though, from their contextual and aesthetic similarities, they play on many of the same themes. Both film stories are being told very specifically from the mind of a child. We get this unreliable, distorted view of a child simply trying to understand the world around them, something that is hard enough without ghost children giving you horrific visions or your toilet disappearing. We get this component of confusion as these impossible, inexplicable things are happening and being filtered through the view of a child whose perception of the world is already muddled. Another way this perspective of the child interacts with both series is the heightened sense of fear and empathy. A horror film about a shitty group of college kids who make dumb decisions, that's harder to get worried about those characters. But not only does making the protagonist children give some leeway for their poor decision making, it does a good job of heightening the tension. Children are vulnerable, especially as young as they are in both Skinamarink and The Children Under the House, still very much in need of the protection and guidance of their parents. And that extra vulnerability, that sense of confusion, doesn't just help build fear, but also sorrow, an empathy for these protagonists. The Children Under the House is not the end of the story in Kate's Crossing. A sort of successor to The Children Under the House was eventually released, The Children with the Black Eyes. In fact, many of Vintage 8's series take place in the town of Kate's Crossing, so if you're dying for more, definitely check that channel out. And in general, I'd still recommend checking out The Children Under the House after this video, because it's very good. I think what Vintage 8's work, and other work like it, for instance Skinamarink, really mean to me is the future of horror, not just online, but even in the traditional sense. Skinamarink was screened in theaters. Creators who started online, like Kyle Edward Ball or David F. Sandberg, director of Lights Out, which was initially a viral horror short he created, are breaking out into the mainstream industry. Even just really recently with Kane Pixel's Backrooms movie deal with A24. So people in the industry are going to need to start paying attention to these new online creators, because one way or another, these creators are eating up the horror audience. So I wanted to use this last little bit to shout out a few smaller projects I've seen. To be fully transparent, I haven't watched all of these all the way through, but they're doing something unique enough that I think it's worth shouting out, especially when they're doing something different with the format. Angel Hair is an analog horror series taking the form of a nostalgic children's animated TV show that is really well animated and is doing something really interesting with the storytelling. Stockroach is a bit different, a comedy ARG that has to be one of my favorite online projects in the past decade. Incredibly well put together and engaging the whole way through, and also incredibly funny. I was lucky enough to visit New York and meet up with Kevin Y recently, the creator, during a screening for another project of his, The Book of Ashpa Gop, which is also a fantastic project that I'd recommend. One of the most creative people doing stuff online right now, and his work is like a breath of fresh air. I may or may not be working on a video about some of his work soon. Recently, I started watching Ye VHS Tape of Old, which is a series of TV episodes and commercials done in a very early 2000s 3D animation style, with a lot of attention to detail and the realism of the VHS effects, right down to the VHS case. Oh, and one of my favorite channels, Atomic Shrimp, has been doing like this old-timey dystopian thing on YouTube Shorts, which is very different than any of his other content. There's so many different projects I could name, but I'd like to hear from you. Let me know some of your favorite underrated web series, whether they be horror or not, in the comments. Well, it appears that's the end of our first session, but please do come again. For real though, thank you all for watching. This was a very fun little video to make. Our next video, as voted on by the patrons, is part 2 of our little digital horror series, looking over a few different digital horror genre series. So if you want exclusive and early access content and the ability to vote on future video topics, as well as just to support the channel, consider joining my Patreon. Also, the music that I composed for this video should be on Spotify by now. I'll see you all next time.